Welcome back. The National Prosecuting Authority today enrolled the reopening of the inquest into Steve Biko's death in the Gqeberha High Court. The anti-apartheid activist and black consciousness movement leader died 48 years ago after allegedly being tortured by police. Biko's death was attributed to severe brain damage, kidney failure and other complications. The NPA says the reopening of the inquest will present evidence that will help the High Court decide whether the death was caused by someone's actions or failure to act. Let's speak to the former reporter at the Rand Daily Mail, Helen Zille, who lifted the lid on the story. Helen, a very good evening to you. Now, you've welcomed the opening of this inquest. I want you to take us back a little after you broke the story and you were summoned to the Apartheid Press Council. Tell us about that experience and that time.
Yes, it was a very difficult time and a very difficult experience because obviously the apartheid regime was involved in covering up many deaths in detention. There was also always some absurd explanation, such as he slipped on a bar of soap, he fell out of a window, he jumped out of a window, he hit his head on a wall, he tried to hit the security police, so they pushed him back and he hit his head on the wall, which was the argument they used in Steve Biko's case. And in every single instance, there was this attempt to cover up the brutality, the torture and the murder of people who were detained without trial and without access to legal representation or anything else. And in Steve Biko's case, we all know what happened, and we all know that eventually we were able to track the medical records and then report on them, which could expose it. But obviously, the state was determined to keep those things under wraps. And so they demanded to know our source, and I wouldn't give them the source, obviously. And then they took me to the Apartheid Press Council under Judge Galgut, and we were put under a lot of pressure. And when we refused to reveal our sources and couldn't say exactly who had said what, because we wouldn't say, we could of course say, but we didn't, then they found us guilty of misleading reporting and tendentious reporting. And they said we had no sources and we were basically inventing it. And then they ordered us to publish a retraction and an apology, which was one of the very worst days of my journalistic career, because I knew that every word in that report was accurate, but that I would then have been found guilty, even if it was by an apartheid tribunal, of tendentious and misleading reporting, which I was very determined never to do. I always tried to be as accurate and objective as I could. But this really had nothing to do with me. This was about getting the truth out there about the death of Steve Biko.
What was it exactly about this death in particular? You know, you mentioned that you always knew about these murders and there were always these ridiculous excuses that were made or justifications that were given. What was it about this one in particular that sparked you to say, actually, I'm going to move above and beyond this excuse that we're getting?
Well, I was a very young journalist at the time. I think it was the first high-profile death in detention since I'd become a journalist. And Steve Biko was a leader with a very high profile. He was about 30 years of age, if I recall. He had been a very strong student leader. He had a high public profile nationally, and he was challenging the ANC's narrative for dominance of resistance politics in South Africa. And so he had a widespread following in the Eastern Cape very strongly, but also across South Africa. And he was a very dynamic public speaker, wrote a lot, and was, I suppose, the voice of his age. And that is why it was such a reverberating death. It was such a reverberating murder, and it reverberated all over the world. It was who Steve Biko was and the trajectory for South Africa's future and the liberation movements that he represented. And I have no doubt that if he had lived, South Africa's historical trajectory would have been different. So that was obviously a huge story. And when Jimmy Kruger, who was then the Minister of Justice, came out with this ridiculous line that he died after going on a hunger strike, trying to make out as if he had starved himself to death in 1 week after having been arrested, which anyone who knows nothing will tell you is not possible for a grown man of the physique size that Steve Biko was. We knew that he was lying. And my editor and I were both determined to get to the truth, and so we went after it.
Speaking about also getting to the truth now, the NPA says it may have 2 persons of interest that could be held accountable who are still alive. Those who testified, of course, at the TRC are no longer alive. How much faith do you have that there will be living persons who can be held accountable 48 years later?
Well, I think the main people will have died by now. People like Gideon Niveau, people like Harold Snyman, and those police that interrogated Steve Biko, I think, were the major perpetrators of that murder. I'm glad that they still have people who are alive and who could be held accountable. That is very important. I don't know who those individuals are, but I haven't read about them yet, but I'd be very interested to know. Then there's also a lot of evidence that can be looked at again, because at the inquest at the old synagogue in Pretoria, there was an enormous amount of evidence that the magistrate Martinez Prince simply ignored. He didn't even take it into account, and it had all been put on the table, and then he simply found in a single sentence that nobody could be held responsible for Steve Biko's death. And it was over in one sentence. There was this collective stunned silence in the room. I'll never forget it. So there's all that evidence. And then there's also the Truth and Reconciliation evidence, where a lot of the policemen went and tried to get amnesty and did not get amnesty. But they were required to tell the truth in order to get amnesty. And it would be very interesting to compare what they said before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with what they said at the inquest and how that differed. So I think there's a lot of evidence that can still be put together and is there on the record. It would be very interesting to hear any new evidence. But even if the inquest finds that the people who can be held responsible for Steve Biko's murder are dead, even if those people are dead, it is worth getting to the truth for its own sake. Truth has a value in its own right, and people have to know that the evil that they do lives after them, and they can't run away from it.
With those sentiments right there, do you believe more inquests into apartheid-era killings should be reopened?
Well, I do think that in all killings where there hasn't been the full truth told, we should get to the bottom of it. In present-day South Africa, I would love to see a lot of the people responsible for these ghastly assassinations of whistleblowers and witnesses in courts of law and political assassinations. I would like to see the truth behind those uncovered, because when people are arrested, it's always the guys who pull the trigger, not the kingpins behind all of this, who pay a lot of money to get other people murdered. And we can't live in a democracy if people are murdered like this. We can't. It's just not possible. Living in a democracy means being free to speak your mind, being free to compete for positions, being held accountable to the law, everybody being equally accountable to the law and not a law unto themselves. And if we can't get those basics right, we can't ever be a sustainable democracy. So every time somebody is murdered, it is an assault on democracy. And that is why we need all of these things to be prosecuted properly. We need the truth to be told, and we need people who murder other people for their own political or financial ends. They need to have the severest penalties meted out to them, and not just the guys who pull the trigger, but the kingpins behind them.
Helen, thank you so much for joining us this evening.